I want Andy to sort of introduce himself this morning. So, Andy, if you would take a few minutes and tell me a little bit about your history and background and how you came to the Unitarian Church in Augusta.
Okay, I'm originally from Northeast Oklahoma, grew up on a farm outside of the large area of 900 people. Junior college for a year and then University of Oklahoma, where I got a BS degree, worked for a couple of years to pay off some debts, which was a fortunate thing. Worked for an oil company outside of Wichita, Kansas, and that's where I met my wife, Alice, and this summer we will have been married 55 years. Graduate school at the University of Missouri, postdoctoral work at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and another year of postdoctoral work at Mount Sinai in New York City. And then we moved to Augusta, to the Medical College of Georgia. I'm an immunologist, and so I did research in immunology and taught, got into, at the end of my career, into computer-assisted instruction modules, one of which was in biomedical ethics. In Cleveland, Alice and I became involved with a Presbyterian congregation that the Presbytery of Ohio had formed these congregations called Congregations of Reconciliation in 4 major cities as a response to Martin Luther King's assassination. The idea was that people would come out of the regular churches for the 4-year life of the Presbytery had funded these congregations for, learn about racism, do some work in anti-racism, and then go back into their congregations as leaders in that area. So for 4 years, we were involved in teaching about structural racism in suburban white churches. We moved to Augusta, looked around. There wasn't anybody doing anything like that. We didn't know about the Unitarian Church. So we became church dropouts for 17 years. We built our careers. We started feeling the need for connection and community, and by then I had heard that there was a Unitarian church here, and one of my colleagues at work was a member, actually was the president at the time, and I asked him for information, and Alice and I showed up the next Sunday, and it was probably close to 20 years before we missed a Sunday that we were actually in town. So we found a home as soon as we walked in. They were doing the kind of work that we thought needed to be done. And so been very active in a number of ways since then, including serving for 10 years as a ministerial associate, which is kind of a lay minister under the direction of the settled minister.
You've also been very active in the interfaith community. Can you recap that and explain how that sort of parallels your interest in the topic of social justice?
Yeah, in the late 90s, there was again another flare-up of anti-Muslim activity in across the country. I don't even remember right now what particular incident caused that. And so some of the Unitarians and Muslim community got together, talked about it, and broadened the base some. And we started the Interfaith Fellowship of Augusta that has a 1-year hiatus in the late, 2008 probably, has been going since then. We reorganized during that 1 year. I served as the first president and for several years, and then turned it over to a more general approach, different people taking turns, yearly turns and whatever, and I'm the immediate past president of that. We now have 10 different religions involved. And then one of our former ministers, Roy Reynolds, actually it may have been Dan King, was invited to participate in a Martin Luther King celebration here in town, and some people got upset that he was not a, quote, Christian. So that eventually led to the formation of the Progressive Religious Coalition. And I was invited to join that 3 or 4 years after it started. The Progressive Religious Coalition puts on a interfaith Martin Luther King celebration every year. And around his birthday, we have had speakers like Raphael Warnock, the minister at Ebenezer Baptist King's Old Church, Otis Moss III, who was Obama's minister, number of others, West, William Barber twice, the Cornell West once. So an impressive number of people involved in that, and I'm the current president of that organization. So.
You've also stayed busy writing books. Can you tell me about the books you've written?
Yeah, the first one was called Rational Spirituality. It was my attempt to to show how religion can and should be influenced by what knowledge has been gained in the sciences. So I put that together, writing a chapter on science, for instance, on the physical sciences, and then explaining how that influenced our conceptions of the origins of the universe, how life came to be, evolution, how all of that fit together for a deeper understanding of how we're all connected, rather than just some supernatural force said we should be. The second one, the first one was published in 2004, I think. The second one is religious humanism, putting together my thoughts on the role of humanism, how it affects my life, but adding the religious idea to it because religion brings in the idea of community. So humanism focuses on the worth and dignity of every person, the fact that they ought to have the right to thrive and develop to their fullest. Sounds like our first principle, doesn't it? And then bringing in the idea of community is important because humans are social animals, and we live and have our being in community. And so bringing that together is an important part of who we are.
So I noticed in conversation that you've emphasized religious humanism versus secular humanism,
Right.
and so the idea is that of community
Right.
that religion brings to the table. You also somewhere I think were working on a novel, weren't you?
Yeah, I became, we're fans of Walter Edgar, the historian that on South Carolina Public Radio. He's got a noon program on Fridays. And we heard that he was leading a group tour of some of the South Carolina battlefields and from the Revolutionary War. And so we took that tour and we were fascinated, and some of the stories he told were amazing. And I thought they lent themselves to a fictional account based on the real history. And so the one book became too long, and I expanded it, and it's now 2 books that I'm still working on at times and not having much luck getting a publisher, but it's been fun writing and the history because I've always been a history buff. But the short story is the American Revolution was won in South Carolina and adjacent border areas in Georgia and North Carolina. Cornwallis got to Yorktown to surrender starting from Charleston. And that is an interesting story too. But it's been fun.
Yeah, I think I remember a comment one time you said as you were writing, the characters sort of took on a life of their own.
Yeah. Yeah, they, all novelists will tell you they do that. And sometimes you start to try to have them do something and the character says, I really wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah. You've also served in several church positions, and just recently you're finishing up a term as the church president.
Yeah, my
So
second.
it's been a sort of a strange church year with a lot of challenges, and one of them I know is, getting a new interim minister, but also dealing with the pandemic and things like that has also, I know, presented some problems in terms of how to navigate that space. You want to care to comment on any of those?
Yeah, an interim minister brings change with him or her. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. And so with the arrival of Reverend Don Cameron, we knew that we had needed to improve our social media presence, for instance. He pointed out that we really, really needed to deal with that and bring it up to speed and to emphasize it. And so that was one of the things we had taken on. Also, our social justice committee, people had gotten a bit burned out, and the younger members coming into the congregation, the younger adults bringing their children and whatever, were really, really interested in social justice issues. Mm-hmm. And so we started to reconstitute that, bring new blood, new ideas into it. And we were making some progress. We had gotten some new people involved, consolidated some things, really improving the social media thing, and then COVID hit. And it did 2 things. It made it harder to continue the social justice thing because no face-to-face meetings and trying to deal with other things. So that didn't stop, but it did slow down. And the other thing it forced us to do was we immediately had to amp up our social media and our online presence so that we could do our Sunday services, could stream the Sunday services, although we record them and play them back on Sundays. And that's gone pretty well. It hasn't even hit our budget that hard in terms of pledges. People have been maintaining their pledges pretty well. It probably hurt us a little bit on our pledge drive this year, but we've got a balanced budget for the coming year. So it's been difficult. One of the saving graces has been the congregation gave me one of the best church boards that I have seen. The people are engaged and committed and bright, and it has been a pleasure to work with them.
Yeah, I read over the notes that you put together for the upcoming annual meeting, and it sounded like, despite the difficulty, the board had accomplished quite a lot this past year. A lot of things on the plate, and they dealt with them. So what do you see as, I'm one of the issues that is intriguing is how the churches are going to handle reopening and what the long-term impacts on community might be. And part of the reason for this particular experiment, if you want to call it that, a project, is to see if there's a way that both electronic connection and in face-to-face community will coexist in some useful way that sort of expands the reach of both.
Yeah, I think it will. It was interesting. The first 3 Sundays that we broadcast online, the services online, the attendance, either live or watching the videos later, was, I don't know, probably a third higher than had been attending the regular services. Now, it's fallen off some since then, and I think that tells us 2 things. It tells us that there is an audience for the online services, that people do get something out of it. The fact that it started to fall off is telling us that community is important, that we really do like to get together and be together. And that something vital is missing when we are not able to do that. So I think going forward, we will be looking at how to combine those. Do we have regular church service and broadcast it and record it like the other larger churches do? Or how do we manage that? I really expect that a lot of the committee meetings will be done online. Committees of, groups of under 10 or 12 can function quite well on Zoom meetings. And it is easier to do it on Zoom than having to rush from work to church, home to take care of the kids and then to the meeting and that kind of thing. I'm not surprisingly on the committee to look at reopening the church and how we can do that. We're following CDC guidelines, keeping up with infection rates. I noticed the headline on the Sunday Chronicle a few minutes ago that Georgia is moved past South Carolina in number of or percentage of infections that are being reported now. So it's going to be a little bit longer than I had hoped before we'll be able to reopen in person. Certainly not before the 1st of July, and probably later than that.
Mm. Yeah, that's a challenge. I'm not sure how churches are going to deal with it. I mean, I agree with you. I think that face-to-face meetings are an important part of community, and yet you balance it with the risk to people in the congregation, and so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. There's also this continuing tension in our society between reopening so people can have social contact and make a livelihood, and the idea of reducing the risk of infection. So that's a political, it's become a political issue, and I suppose it is because it's also a social issue. So it'll be interesting to see how churches in particular navigate that space. So I don't, and I think the challenge will be to somehow do that while making it possible for people to be involved who aren't ready to reconnect face to face. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting.
So we're looking at a number of possibilities, including meeting outside. Might have to meet earlier because the heat builds up pretty quickly after 11 o'clock. But that would be a possibility, more space for distancing, and sunlight is a huge disinfectant. There are no viruses that can stand more than 5 or 10 minutes of direct sunlight. So that makes a big difference also. But it's all the churches, organizations are going to be facing this question. And of course, churches tend to skew to an older population, and those of us who in that category are more at risk. So it's a problem. I've recently moved into a retirement community, and the precautions that they take here to make sure that nobody brings the infection in from the outside is impressive. It's a little bit onerous being in quarantine for 14 days, but it's the same principle. You've got a highly susceptible population that you need to take more extreme measures to protect, and that fits the churches.
Yeah, I'm going to change topics a little bit and just talk about your role as a religious humanist and talk about fairness and things like that as part of religious humanism. So one of the common threads in humanism and religious humanism is the idea of that humans as a whole should thrive.
Yes.
That's part of the premise of humanism. And yet the question a lot of times in social connections, church connections, and even the current conflict around Black Lives Matter is who thrives. So even in the pandemic, it's a question of, so I notice a lot as I go out in the to buy groceries and things like that, I notice the younger population doesn't really feel much at risk. So they don't wear masks, they don't take many precautions. The people, I was in Kroger yesterday, maybe 10% of the people were wearing masks, and most of those were either older members of the population or members of the Black community. So it's an interesting dilemma for society. The question is, well, how much how much effort should society make to protect, overprotect or protect a portion of society rather than just society as a whole, who may not be as much affected, for example, by the pandemic. So, you have any thoughts on that from a religious humanist perspective?
Um, I'm not sure that it's a specifically religious humanist perspective. It's my perspective,
Sure. Okay.
or influenced by my religious humanism, I suppose, but also by my background as an immunologist, whatever. Um, yeah, the idea is that everyone should thrive. What does that mean? It means everyone should have the resources that they need to achieve their full potential. That means good schools. That means decent housing, safety, uh, good, good nutritious food available. Those kinds of things. Since the 1890s, we have forced the Black population into areas, concentrated areas that we then systematically underfunded schools, protection, whatever. And that takes its toll. I've recently started a book called My Grandmother's Hands, and it's, I can't remember the author's name. It's a little bit of an unusual name. But he's a trauma psychologist, and he's talking about how racism and the anxiety around that produces chronic underlying trauma in both the white and Black populations. And other minority populations are Native Americans and Asian, some of the smaller, the other religious groups, etc. That's internalized. Now, obviously, it's harder on the Black population because the oppression is deeper. Anytime a young Black man steps outside the door of his house, the thought has to cross his mind, well, I lived through this foray. And even inside their house now is becoming more dangerous. That's internalized. That shows up in poorer health, diabetes, high blood pressure, those kinds of things. It's one of the reasons why the Black population has a higher death rate from COVID, because that underlying tension, anxiety, trauma, weakens their immune systems. So it shows itself in a number of ways. If the Black population could fix it, it would have been fixed hundreds of years ago. It's up to the white population, those of us who benefit directly or indirectly from the structural racism that's built into the fabric of our society, to take that on. If we actually believe in what the principles that we espouse, then we're the ones that have to deal with it. We're the ones that have to take the lead. And I heard the other day of a specific example of that. One of the things that I found heartening about the excuse me, heartening about the demonstrations has been the high percentage of white faces that have been involved. And I heard the other day that in one of the cities, a demonstration was going on, and the police were becoming more aggressive and starting to push harder and whatever. And the cry "White Shield" went up, and the white people in the crowd surged to the front and formed a line across the front, confronting the police. And the police immediately stopped being as aggressive and cooled down some from that stance that they had taken. We do have more power than our black brothers and sisters, and we have to be willing to make ourselves uncomfortable to use that power so that all of us have that same freedom. As Dr. King pointed out so many years ago, if some of us aren't free, then none of us are free.
Do you, one more quick question, and then we'll open it up for anybody else that wants to ask questions, is you have been active in Augusta, in the sort of the racial tensions within the community, at least aware of them through your interfaith connections. So in looking at the situation with policing in Augusta and in trying to balance the role that most of us want to be safe in our homes, we don't want to have burglaries. It's disruptive, and at the same time, we don't want people killed unnecessarily. So it's balancing this tension. Do you have any idea where we are in terms of that in our local community, say the Augusta area?
The Augusta area may be better off than some, but one problem that I see, and interestingly in the book that I talked about my grandmother's hands, he had three categories. He had the white population, the black population, and the police as distinct cultures. And in general, across the country, the police culture is a warrior culture. Now that's a broad generalization. It's not true everywhere. It's not true of all the members of any of the departments. I want to make that clear. But that's generally the way things are approached. And until that changes from a warrior mentality to a service mentality, we've got problems. You know, the almost universal motto of police departments across the country is protect and serve. Well, we've forgotten the serve part. Augusta, being a somewhat smaller community, having a black chief of police and sheriff does bring community policing more into play. The officers do tend to know the people better, interact with them more, but it's still a tension. You know, one of the things that occurred to me earlier that I didn't think to mention when we were talking about reopening the businesses and churches and whatever, is we trade off safety and economic activity all the time. Every time you get in your car to drive somewhere, you're doing that. The speed limit on the interstate is 70 miles an hour. Well, if they made that 45 miles an hour, it would save a whole bunch of lives. But nobody would pay attention to it. We value the economic value of our time. And so we're trading some lives for some economic benefit. So that is a legitimate trade-off that people are looking at in terms of reopening. Now, I happen to think that Georgia and some of the other states made the wrong decision or made the decision too early to reopen. I think that we needed to give it another couple of weeks, but it is a consideration that one has to make.
Okay. Andy, I'm going to open it up for anybody else that would like to ask a question or continue the conversation. And then promptly at about 10 o'clock, we'll finish up the meeting, so we don't go beyond what we've committed to. Anybody have a question? Debbie?
Well, I just ran into a head-on collision between the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter with my son in Brooklyn, who is had been in shelter forcibly but voluntarily also for about 6 weeks, and was so filled with emotion this week, decided it was time to leave and join the protest. So it's really an ethical question too about where do you place your values? How do you set your priorities going through a time like this? So I called him and I couldn't help but ask him, are you in quarantine now? And he wrote me back, I'm social distancing. Have you ever been in a protest? Well, of course, it's been a number of years since Vietnam. So,
Yeah.
so I just wanted your comments.
Yeah, that's been an interesting dynamic with the protests occurring during this time of pandemic, and with, in fact, the Black population being more at risk, and yet the Black population needing to protest the fact that they've been more at risk for everything for 400 years. So how do you balance that out?
Right.
And many of them have opted to join in the protests, even though it means crowding, even though it exposes them to a higher risk, because I think in almost all the cases consciously, they looked at the risk and need, and decided that the need was greater than the risk.
Yeah, I think the balancing of risk is something that's an ethical concern as well as, a political concern.
Mm-hmm.
So Andy, as an immunologist, what are your thoughts on the risk? I mean, is it like, I know it's pretty risky to be out in a protest and everything, but I don't know, like, in your professional opinion, how risky is it?
Well, obviously it makes a difference if everybody's wearing masks. And if you look at pictures of the protests, a really high percentage of the people are wearing the masks. Fairly recent research out of Germany has shown that the overwhelmingly primary mode of transmission is airborne, that the transmission from surfaces, doorknobs, countertops, and whatever really is not that high. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use your disinfectant wipes and whatever, but the key is reducing airborne transmission, and masks do that. My wearing a mask protects you from me if I happen to be infected but not yet symptomatic, and vice versa. So the two together is shown to significantly reduce the risk of transmission. I've seen estimates of 40 to 80%. So it's certainly worthwhile. It is. I do find it interesting. The people that refuse to wear the masks in the grocery stores and whatever have no problem with the sign out front that says no shirt, no shoes, no service. It's the same kind of thing. And yet, because it's been politicized, the idea that wearing a mask is somehow giving up freedoms is, to me, silly.
You guys were talking about your observations that you noticed the high risk folks wearing masks. I went to the grocery store the other day, and it seemed like the high risk folks were the ones not wearing masks. And I just wanted to go around and be like, do you need a mask? I'll try to get you a mask. Like it made me want to go to the grocery store with masks and just hand them out to people. I was just shocked.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I also noticed a difference between men and women, particularly older white males and young white males weren't interested in masks. There was sort of an intermediate area where, they were obviously had a family where they tended to wear a mask more frequently, but older white males and younger males in particular tended not to wear them at all.
Yeah. I'm not only old, 78 in a couple of weeks.
oh my goodness.
I'm also immunocompromised. If I get COVID, the odds are I'll die. So I kind of think it's important to wear a mask and for other people to wear a mask when they're around me.
There's
So
also
one of the things that crossed my mind is, well, if you don't care about protecting yourself from the virus, then why am I in here wearing a mask trying to protect you? But I am also trying to protect myself. But it was just an interesting thought that I felt that way.
the other thing that I've seemed to notice is that it seems to be, and again because of the way the virus has passed, that indoor spaces where there's close contact is a lot different than outdoor spaces where there's, even if there isn't maybe 6 foot distance, at least you're not in a confined space where that things tend to circulate as much. So I felt pretty comfortable. I get out on the greenway. And I don't wear a mask, but I also don't have social contact with people while I'm exercising. But it's sort of like, well, the breeze is blowing, I'm on my bike, I got wind past my face. It seems like that's a lesser risk than being in a confined space.
Yeah, and in fact, here at Brandonwild, the retirement community, people are not asked to wear masks outside. If you see somebody and stop and talk, you're supposed to maintain your distance. But just out walking is really a very low risk proposition. So,
anybody else?
My concern on meeting outside as a church, even with social distancing, I think the real danger is in the bathrooms. Unless you have meticulous care of the bathrooms, and people should be wearing their masks when they go into the bathroom, even if they're not outside. right? And using sanitizer or Kleenex to open the door into the bathroom and closing it. And I just find it, people seem to look at that as being obsessive. But that's the protocol that I've been reading.
Yeah, I understand that. I agree with you about bathrooms being enclosed spaces. They also have tend to be higher humidity, which the coronavirus doesn't like. But in terms of the surfaces, I don't know that using a tissue or a paper towel to open the doors and whatever is necessary. As I said, getting enough viral load off of the surfaces is hard. So wash your hands thoroughly before you leave. Open the door with your left hand maybe instead of your right hand. So, you know, take it for what it's worth. So.
And also singing in the choir is supposed to be, you know, the different levels. That was something I read about the protests too, is that because the levels of shouting propels the virus further than the 6 meters or 6 feet, whatever.
Yeah, and tear gas. You know,
oh yeah, and tear gas.
causing tearing and a lot more mucus flow and whatever, which carries the virus, is a problem. Yeah, singing projects more fine droplets in the air. The infection rate among choir members before they closed churches down was significantly higher than in the rest of the congregation, for instance. So, yeah, any of those kinds of situations are increase the transmission rate. I find it interesting that people attending Trump's rally in Tulsa are required to sign a waiver that they will not sue the campaign if they come down with the virus that the campaign has labeled a hoax. So,
Yeah.
but again, rallies, political rallies, have people in close proximity yelling and cheering and whatever, and that's a recipe for propelling more virus out into the environment.
Yeah, I think the challenge is again going to be, you know, there's one of the perceptions on the other side that I have to deal with is people that somehow, you know, all pandemic deaths can be avoided. And the answer is, from what I see, is without a vaccine, the answer is no. You can slow the rate so that hospitals can manage them, but basically, if it's just a statistical relationship between the people at risk and the percentage of the virus in the population, there's not much you can do to actually prevent it. You might slow it down, but ultimately the end numbers would look to be the same. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, we have flu outbreak every year, don't we?
Yep.
And we have flu vaccines. It's just that influenza virus mutates more rapidly than the coronavirus, although the coronavirus is mutating. Yeah, I fault myself when I first started reading about the outbreak in Wuhan, China. I knew it was going to spread worldwide. You just can't stop it in today's interconnected world. I didn't logically follow that out. I did not change my investment strategy on my retirement funds, which I should have done, although I'd done a little bit of that earlier. But more importantly, I didn't have the church preparing for it in advance, that it was going to get here and that we were going to need to be able to deal with it. So, yeah, it's a hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Well, I think the whole country has been on a learning curve. It's not the only outbreak that we've faced, but it's the only one at this scale that's had the consequences, economic consequences and disruption of life. So I think that's, maybe the flu pandemic in the early 1920s or early 1900s had a similar effect, but I wasn't around then. So for my era, this is the only thing that I faced that's had that sort of impact.
Yeah.
But I'm reminded, one time I visited Cades Cove in Tennessee, and just like one time you pointed out in the Augusta cemeteries, if you go to cemeteries, you can look through the dates on the tombstones, and you can sort of see when epidemics came through the community. It's pretty amazing if you look for it, that suddenly here's a year and a whole family's wiped out, or a whole 1 year stands out as being particularly bad. So in terms of impact of epidemics on our society, it's a pretty common phenomenon, but one that I really never paid attention to until somebody pointed it out.
Yeah, you can also go to the cemeteries and you can see when antibiotics came into use.
Is that right?
Yeah, there's not as many children dying.
Yeah.
There's the Somerville Cemetery. There's one family plot there that has 7 gravestones in a row. None of those children lived to be over 4. They died in different years of different causes, but it was before antibiotics. The flu pandemic in 1918 was, they actually did try quarantine and separating people out, which was somewhat effective. But interestingly, on November the 11th of that year, people rushed out into the streets to celebrate the end of World War I. And they hugged, they cheered, they shouted, they whatever. And that was the beginning of the second wave of infections. They killed more people than the first wave did.
What happened during polio? I've heard that like kids weren't allowed to go outside and movie theaters and that kind of thing. And but nobody can tell me because nobody remembers or was around that I've asked.
Several of us on this group were there.
Yeah. And so did people have the same backlash were things closed?
Yeah, parents were terrified.
Yeah.
Growing up in the country, it didn't affect me, my family as much, but parents in cities were terrified. Pools closed down, beaches closed down. Parents wouldn't let kids out of the house. So it did have some of that same kind of thing, and partly they didn't know how it was transmitted.
Right.
We know how COVID is transmitted, and so we can take precautions. Turns out that transmission by flies was a significant factor in polio. But yeah, that's another example Ebola is more recent. Now, Ebola only killed 2 people in this country, but people were rather frightened of it because it had a really high mortality rate. So we're always going to have diseases, pandemics, etc. We're always going to be lagging in our fight against it. But, you know, humans have survived.
Was there this backlash about the economy with polio, or was it like, were people agreeable because it was affecting children, or what do you think made the difference?
Polio affected children more than adults, and so
Right.
it didn't shut the economy down like that.
Okay. Just certain places that kids would tend to go was all it affected. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
So it's about a couple minutes after 10, and I don't want to extend this beyond what we sort of agreed to with Andy, so I'll go ahead and discontinue it. I want to thank Andy for being with us this morning and talking with us.
Been
I
fun.
think he's an interesting member of our community that has a lot to offer in both terms of professional experience and also actual experience within dealing with some of the issues that are relevant to our community. So I want to thank you for being here with us this morning, Andy.
Sure.
Any final comments from anybody?
Thank you, Andy. It was really good to hear your perspectives.
Enjoyed it. You all be safe.
Okay.
You too. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
We'll see you, April.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.